Como digo, es la profesora doña Linda Nochlin, profesora de Arte Moderno en el prestigioso Instituto de Bellas Artes de la Universidad de Nueva York. Con anterioridad había sido también docente en las universidades de Yale y en el Vassar College, en esta misma ciudad. Su trayectoria está reconocida con importantes galardones en su país y ha sido invitada a participar en cursos, conferencias y seminarios en museos y universidades de Estados Unidos, Europa y Asia. Sus obras también han sido traducidas a numerosos idiomas y ha sido también comisaria de varias exposiciones. Su especialización, el arte de los siglos XIX y XX, el realismo, el impresionismo, con especial atención en la figura de Courbet y en la representación de la mujer, las mujeres artistas, su obra y en cómo las cuestiones de género influyen y afectan al arte. Fue, por tanto, la primera historiadora del arte que trató el tema de la mujer a partir de la asignatura Mujeres y Arte que empezó a impartir en el Vassar College en el año 69. En el 72 publica el ensayo ¿Por qué no ha habido grandes mujeres artistas?, libro por el que es considerada como la fundadora de la historia del arte feminista. En el marco también de su preocupación por la representación de lo social en el arte, su conferencia de hoy versará sobre la representación de la pobreza a principios del siglo XIX.
I need a little more height, like a cushion.
I don't know how, but
Yeah.
let me think about it.
Okay.
Begin and then we try to
Okay, fine. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to say how grateful I am to have been invited to this prestigious cycle of lectures, and how happy I am to be lecturing at one of my preferred, my favorite museums in the whole world. That is the Prado. Every time I come to Madrid, the first thing I do is rush to see Velázquez immediately. That is my first move on coming to this wonderful city. And I did it this time too. But that, alas, is not what I will be talking about this time. What I am talking about is something more difficult, in some ways more painful. Géricault, Goya, and the representation of misery following the Industrial Revolution. Now, why? Why would I talk about such a subject? And how will I be engaged with it? And what will I be engaged with? Why I am engaged is fairly obvious. Indeed, there are many reasons. But the first is because of the economic situation today. And I think that makes you think of the subject of misery. This is a moment when public services are being cut, when people are losing their jobs, when money is short, when suffering appears on the streets, and even more behind closed doors. This is a bad and displacing economic moment in our history. Secondly, I am interested in this subject of misery because I am involved in the languages of representation. And I am an art historian, not a visual culturist, so I am concerned with the phenomenology of the object, but the object as a part of history. Close looking is what I do. Not beholding, not gazing, I look. Wide reading is also what I do. Not generalizing, not theorizing, but reading of the image. I am deeply concerned with surfaces, not depths. For example, in this work, Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, created by the Frenchman Théodore Géricault on his second trip to London in 1821, I focus on bricks in their sheer reiterative monotony that speak the desolate built environment of post-industrial Britain. Géricault knew this. He saw it. He absorbed its lessons in visual terms. Brickwork becomes the almost obsessive setting of all three of the works featuring misère that I will be speaking about. This, called Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, is a large lithograph, and it represents a drunken old beggar, half unconscious, sprawled out on the pavement in front of a bakery window, his left leg awkwardly extended onto the cobbled road, leaning for support against the brick wall behind him. Its title, Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, is based on a popular poem of the time. And the image suggests, and I'll show you some details, the image suggests that this worn-out beggar, his right hand still outstretched to receive coins, had once led a more prosperous life. The multiple layers of clothing Géricault has so carefully designated look particularly at the, at the lower right image. You can see all he has quite a lot of layers of clothing on here. Refer at once to his homelessness. He's forced to wear everything he owns at the same time, and to a better past. His gentlemanly top hat here is broken. His once sturdy shoes now display holes and a broken surface. Moreover, what we can see of his shadowed face is quite handsome, quite refined, in fact. He is certainly not caricatured or grotesque, and certainly his face is more appealing than that of the vulgar commercial couple behind him to the left. Géricault has created the pathos of his image through a series of understated emphases and contrasts. The open, relaxed gesture of the poor old man, as against the vulgar, grasping gestures of the bakery woman and her customer, and the almost casual emphasis of the gentle, reassuring dog who puts his paw on the beggar's knee. The dog, clearly a mongrel, is positioned as the only living creature to care about his master, this remnant of humanity discarded on the streets of London. This detail, the knee, the paw, the dog, this is surely the central point of the print. Far from being a trendy punctum, Roland Barthes' designation of an irrelevancy that captures the eye of the beholder, this detail lies at the very heart of its meaning. The diminished, yet intense and intensely moving synecdoche of lost feeling and humanity, caught within the immense social uncaringness of the post-industrial 1820s London, with its blank surfaces of brick and stone. As such, it is a very different trope, say, from Landseer's The Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner of 1837, with its faithful sheepdog keeping watch over its master's abandoned coffin. The figure group is set against the varied, inorganic background of the urban environment. To the left, the bars of the window. Let's see what I got there. To the left, the bars of the window, which makes a grid. The animated figures, male and female, half in, half out, the bread on display, but out of reach for the poor old man, the woody, textured verticals of the boards, you see here, which are contrasted with the beautifully modulated and intensely detailed texture of the brickwork against which he leans, and the irregular, larger paving stones down below on which he is seated with one leg awkwardly extended into the cobbled roadway to the right. There to the right, the mundane life of the great city hurries on under the gray, fog-clouded light of dusk or dawn. The garbage collector in the background here guides his horses up the road, while a cloaked and bonneted figure here hurries on down the road, intent on some task. Thus, extreme poverty is contrasted both with petty bourgeois commerce, working class physical poverty, and far away, rising like a vision, out of the fog, across the river, over Blackfriars Bridge, the great commercial heart of the great city, and its manifestation, St. Paul's Cathedral. But it is we, the viewers of the print, that must provide or unpack these meanings. There is no trite symbolism or obvious moralization within the framework of the print itself, conceived under the aegis of a scrupulous and objective realism. Géricault leaves nothing out, generalizes not at all, provides the eye with a feast of interesting information and meaningful relationships. And it is our discerning eye that must savor this feast with both pleasure and pain. Now, Géricault created this print, as I said, on his trip to London in the first months of 1821, as one of a series of 12 prints with a cover, a series titled Various Subjects Drawn from Life and on Stone by J, wrong initial, Géricault, and published a short time after his arrival in England. He made the acquaintance of Hull Mandel, the best printer lithographer in London, and with the editors Rodwell and Martin, with whom he published in the first months of 1821 the 12 lithographs, actually 13 counting the title, which is this, which form the suite of great English lithographs. These prints, Clément assures us, had a lot of success. When the artist had visited England the first time, accompanying his gigantic raft of the Medusa on its triumphal London visit, he had not appreciated the work of his English contemporaries. He had contempt for them. But on the second visit, he had an extreme change of heart, and one might almost say he had an epiphany. The scales fell from his eyes, and he saw differently. Géricault, sensitive to the social radar of the moment, saw that the more democratic art of England, deliberately unelevated genre painting, engaged with the telling details of the everyday contemporary life of its variously classed people, was in some way the art of the future, not the pompous academic, would-be traditional set pieces of the Academy. He understood that England, a leader in commerce, trade, and spectacle, the innovator of the Industrial Revolution at just that era, was also producing a new, more democratic kind of art, an art in which he wished to participate. Lithography was the up-to-date medium of the time, and the depiction of the lower classes in their daily activities, one of his featured subjects. In May 1821, after seeing the summer exhibition of the Royal Academy, he wrote to his friend, the painter Horace Vernet, an enthusiastic letter. I told my father the other day that the only thing your talent lacked was to be steeped in the English school. I repeat it to you, since I know that you have appreciated the little that you have seen of its works. The exhibition just opened has again confirmed me in the belief that color and effect are understood and felt only here. You cannot imagine the beauty of this year's portraits and of many of the landscapes and genre scenes, and of the animals. And of course, Géricault, the horse lover, was enthralled by English animal painting. The animals painted by Ward and by Landseer, aged 18. The old masters themselves have not done better in this line. One must not be ashamed to go back to school. In art, one arrives at beauty only by comparisons. Every school has its character. If only one could unite all these qualities, would not that be perfection? I see that painters here complain that their drawing is inferior and envy the French school as the more accomplished. Don't we complain about our faults? What stupid pride closes our eyes to them? Can we bring honor to our country by refusing to see the good wherever we find it? Won't our works, mixed in the galleries with others, someday proclaim our vanity and presumption? I formed a wish at the exhibition that a number of paintings then before me might be placed in our museum. I wanted them to be a practical demonstration, more useful than prolonged reflection. How useful it would be to show the touching expressions in David Wilkie's work, a genre painter. In one small picture of a very simple subject, he has brought off an admirable effect. The series that Géricault created indeed deals with various subjects. Some like this one, this is the final work, very significant, I think, because his favorite subject, horses, are represented from the rear going out of the picture, that is, under the tunnel of the Adelphi Wharf. Again, brickwork holds the surface. It's a kind of proto-grid, to use Rosalind Krauss's modernist term. All through this, bricks have both an expressive and an iconographic and a formal meaning of holding on to the surface with the dark and mysterious and somewhat death-suggesting blackness of the arch of the wharf stretching behind these figures. But none, I think, are more memorable or more poignant than the 3 lithographs devoted to misery, to the fate of the most poverty-stricken, isolated, and dispossessed of the poor. Pity the Sorrows, the Paralytic Woman, which you see over here, and the Blind Piper. And it is to a detailed examination of these works that I now turn. For there is nothing like these prints in the entire visual repertory of misery, either in the period following the Industrial Revolution or ever, in my opinion. In the words of Régis Michel, who along with Lawrence Eitner has written most profoundly and richly about the artist, quote, "The printmaker tracks down the misery-filled margins of a proletarian city. He is probably the first to make himself the interpreter of the lower depths of the metropolis, to criticize by means of the image the social cost of the Industrial Revolution. First of all, as I mentioned, brick and brickwork are omnipresent in the setting of all the works featuring misery in the series, as is its closing iteration in the Adelphi Wharf. Brick architecture functions as metaphor, metonymy, and environmental reality for the representation of London misery. It is the very sign of the new, overcrowded, poverty-stricken London of commerce and industry. But at the same time, as I said, on the formal level, it acts like a kind of grid holding the surface of the paper at the same time that it menaces with its structural monotony and dark closure. The brickwork grid is literally one with the menace of death in the graveyard to the left of the paralytic woman. But it makes a case for mortality in the setting of the other two misery lithographs as well. Bricks are of the essence in creating the setting for the misery of the industrialized poor later in Gustave Doré's famous series of prints called London, where you can see the lower classes seated in a position not too different from that of Géricault, or looking out under the arch of the railway into the slum backyards, which you see over here. Pity the Sorrows had abundant sources in the popular arts of London. Here we see it as a children's poem telling the pitiful story of the poor old man who once had a flourishing business, children, a posterity, economic security, but now has fallen low. It was also used, the same trope was used to represent a famous politician of the time, very satirically, in Gilray's caricature called Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, with Edmund Burke begging for funds to run his campaign in 1796. The setting, the comparison, and the interaction are even more evident in the paralytic woman. Here we have the contrast between the delicate but unconscious protagonist and the monstrous coarseness of her attendant, who has stopped for a moment to lean against her primitive wheelchair. Other implications are derived from the graveyard, prominent in the background, and the posted handbill. Every bit of this print is significant, and you can look at it and sort of read it for hours, which I did this summer in the Réserve of the Bibliothèque Nationale, looking for every detail. The handbill here, go back. The handbill reads, for all sickness and the blank, 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 and it's posted by a pharmacist up here. And look at the contrast between the splendid horse-drawn hearse in the background and the poor, ad hoc, not quite funereal vehicle in the foreground, or the contrast between the richly clad little boy in the foreground and the toy horse carried by the richly clad little boy in the foreground and the real horse in the background. Or the distinct narrative tension created by the enigmatic glance, malevolent or frightened, or both, that the nursemaid leading the child casts back over her shoulder at the paralyzed woman. Is this a question of the prime urban disease for women as well as men at the time, syphilis, that is hinted at here? Again, absolute concentration on specific details of setting, class, and texture may suggest this. Once more, we have brick defining the urban environment. We have rags contrasted with proper clothing, wood and paper detailed in texture, light and dark appropriately distributed. As in Pity the Sorrows, the architectural framework is a protagonist in the creation of a meaning which is social, economic, and specifically individuated at once. The miserable paralytic woman and her attendant are framed by the stout vertical of the end of the graveyard on one side and the background processional of prosperity on the other. The observing nursemaid and her charge are thrown into relief by the brick rectangle directly behind them directly behind her, and reiterated in the stern vertical bars above. But this print has a double focus, perhaps. The down-and-out chair attendant is as much an alienated London figure as his dead-to-the-world female burden. So perhaps it is not correct to simply say that he is a grotesque accompaniment. He, too, is a figure of misère in this chain of misery meanings. Oops. The specificity of place Géricault created is attested to by a map of London of the period, 1827, which places the poor old man right here at this blue arrow at a site on the South Bank, diagonally across from St. Paul's, right here. There's St. Paul's here. And across Blackfriars Bridge. In fact, he's sitting more or less where Tate Modern is today. I mean, so we can really identify exactly the place. And he was interested enough in the garbage collection aspect of the piece to devote a separate print to this lowest of low occupation, the picking up of the garbage on the streets of London. Goya, too, represented the miserables. He did several series of drawings devoted to the subject, in ink, in brush, and later in charcoal. Yet, nothing could be more different from Géricault's post-industrial revolution understanding of the nature of misery in the early 19th century. And this, of course, is very much due to the fact that beggary occupied a very different place in the social and political ideology of Spain than it did in post-industrial England. For not working, for example, this one, I think that's the one on the left. Certainly one of Goya's most expressive works, done with this is probably from about 1808 to 1814, in brush with gray and black wash. It's a work in the Prado. This is certainly one of Goya's very expressive works. The man wears picturesque rags, masterfully rendered by Goya's masterful brushstrokes. And I'm quoting extensively from the wonderful catalog, Goya and the Age of Enlightenment. In his right hand, he holds a hat for alms, but he also reaches out with his left in order to make his plea sadder and more effective. His worldly goods are strapped to his back. His facial expression, with its wide open, almost bulging eyes and open mouth and the rank, matted hair, make this beggar a paradigm of absolute indigence, a living incarnation of hunger and extreme degradation. Yet the immense difference in visual appearance between Goya's and Géricault's imagery of misery is not due merely to individual differences of style and attitude. It has to do with the unbridgeable chasm between the social meaning of misery in economically reactionary Spain, one of the most economically backward countries in Europe at the time, and post-industrial England, the most economically and materially advanced. Goya, though he may have felt the deepest sympathy with the suffering victims of war or the Inquisition, evidently felt little sympathy for the victims of economic injustice, an attitude shared by many of his most intellectually advanced compatriots. In the case of For Not Working, Goya does not appear to have felt compassion for this creature. His inscription is emphatic. The man has fallen into this state for not working, a severe judgment against the idleness in which many in Spain lived, ruined themselves and therefore the country. A universal theme among Goya's Enlightenment contemporaries was this repudiation of idleness and a similar denunciation of shameless begging. Campomanes, an economic and educational reformer of the period, estimated that there were 140,000 beggars in Spain. He backed economic reforms for the most miserable, but nevertheless blamed the existence of so many beggars on what he regarded as, and I quote, an innate Spanish disposition to idleness, end quote. Melendez Valdez, in the legal essays published in 1821, the very year Géricault created his images of the poor, condemned, and I quote, the moral decadence and brutalization of beggars without a country, without a fixed home, without the least obligation or care, prone to drink and a filthy slovenliness. For Melendez Valdez, like his Enlightenment contemporaries, among them Goya, the poverty that led to begging, lying, crime, and punishment brought about the debasement and dishonor of the nation, end quote. He went on to say that mendicancy was a plague that degrades and destroys society. And he who sanctions it, he says, with injudicious alms, has failed in his civic duty, unwittingly fostering the physical and moral perversion of his fellow citizens. That poverty, and especially mendicancy, were more prevalent in Spain than elsewhere in Europe seemed to be substantiated by beggars being described as typical of the country in foreign travelers' accounts. beggars' arrogance, underhandedness, their pretending to have diseases, and an equally pretended repertory of distressing gestures was frequently commented upon. In other words, it was a time-honored occupation which was looked on with scorn, derision, and even anger by Goya and his Enlightenment circle. But the difference in attitude is mirrored in differences in style and the structure of representation. Goya does not provide any sort of specific setting. These beggars are in a kind of no place. They're not placed in a specific urban setting. And there is a great deal of emphasis on the virtuosity of Goya's pen, its movement, its brilliance in capturing in a few gestures the essence of these poor creatures. Goya represses narrative. In this series, the most marvelous drawings, this is from the Bordeaux period, the ones on the bottom, but also expresses no overt sympathy with the beggars in question and seems mainly interested in the ingenuity of their mode of transportation. I mean, he really wants to know, how does a dog get this thing moving? How does this legless man move the wheels here? He's really, how hideous is this ugly stump which the beggar shows? So that's really what he's getting at here. And there's little sense of contemporary environment as a factor in the composition. Even when alone, like Goya's beggars, in The Blind Bagpipe Player, even when alone, Géricault's beggar presents us with a sense of misery and doom, partly created by the imprisoning brick setting with its ruinous irregularities imposed on the gridded materiality of its being. And I think when I look at this, at the wonderful Hans Haacke piece that I just saw at the Reina Sofia, of ruined buildings which could no longer be continued because of lack of funds. It's a marvelous piece. Very similar to this in equating poverty with the ruin of the architectural setting itself. The musician is nevertheless a unique individual. His ragged clothing, again, and there are many patches, strands of cloth, and so on, pointing to a better past. His little dog patiently waits and seems to be listening. He is blind. What is he playing? His music is silent, his space of existence both empty and constricted. He is far from the individuals comprising the raucous crowd of street vendors who made life hell for the distraught musician in Hogarth's engraving. He is completely alone, except for his equally isolated, abject little white dog. Géricault, as I said, sensitive to the social radar of the moment, knew that the more democratic art of England was really the art of the future. And if you compare his work, for example, with a prototype like Rembrandt's blind beggar with a dog, a blind musician with a dog, you can see that even Rembrandt is more interested in making this figure grotesque, exotic. The dog is sort of pulling on his leash. It's not a very sympathetic image of a beggar, as I think is Géricault's. And at the same time, we have to fit the blind beggar into a whole group of English representations of blind musicians of the period, from the highest of high art, Wilkie's Blind Fiddler, and he was a friend of Wilkie's, to sort of intermediate stages, to the lowest of low art, where this figure appears constantly. And yet, how different is Géricault's interpretation of this work? With these works, we are moving into the space and structure of the documentary, or perhaps the proto-documentary, since, of course, photography had hardly been invented. What was the work of the visual imagery of misery in the early 19th century and this period of the Industrial Revolution? What effects did it have, and on what segments of the public? Could images like these of women and children, these are, of course, anonymous images, working in the mines, affect change? Well, in fact, these crude wood engravings, probably drawn as testimony by Lord Ashley's parliamentary committee investigating labor conditions in the mines, did have an impact. Their very imperfection, their crudeness, their total lack of either sentimentality or aesthetic quality made them all the more convincing as documentation, as presenting the painful truth. Obviously, the work of non-professionals, probably part of the witness accounts of Lord Ashley's commission, they and the many written testimonials of child workers were part of the official report of that parliamentary commission, which achieved the passage of laws forbidding children to work in the mines. One might even think of them as documentary photographs before the fact, visual testimony that appears to rest on its pure indexicality for its power, even though drawn by the human hand, but a hand of such extreme modesty and invisibility, so to speak, that it might well be a lens. But certainly, the first prominent documentary photographer in the United States, Jacob Riis, working at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, documented the terrible living conditions of recently arrived immigrants in New York City. Now, Riis was a journalist and lecturer, and totally accidentally, starting in 1888, a non-professional documentary photographer. Riis had no aesthetic pretensions with his camera. Quote, "I had a use for it, and beyond that I never went," he declares. In fact, he only took pictures for a few years, but nevertheless, it was Riis who, with the help of several other photographers, first used the new flash power technology to make pictures of the slums. The emphasis on dirt, grotesque expressions, and overcrowding, as well as the artless compositions produced by the flash, helped the cause of tenement reform. In a work like this one, called 5 Cents a Spot, of 1889, we catch a glimpse of lodgers in a crowded Bayard Street tenement, where the primitive flash technique is very much in evidence. And Riis was proud of his prowess as an activator, if not as an artist. In his autobiography, he explained that he took the photograph on a midnight expedition with the sanitary police who reported the overcrowding. When the report was submitted to the health board the next day, it did not make much of an impression, says Rees. These things rarely do, put into mere words. Until my negatives, still dripping from the darkroom, came to reinforce them. From my photographs, there was no appeal. So the idea is that visual representations of misery make more of an impression and are more indexical, are more the absolute truth than written reports. Still other I just wanted to compare this photograph by Jacob Riis with Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, because this becomes a current topos. The self-degradation of the drunk who have abandoned dignity, who have no money, who sleep on the ground. Think of the Madonna of humility. Humus and humility come from the same root, and that is what these people are. They are not just poor and downcast and have no place to go, but they are humiliated, they are abased, they are abject, and that's what these photographs, of course, point out. Still another documentary photographer of the early 20th century focused on child labor. This was Louis Hine, and he emphasizes the dignity and pathos of the individualized human being, which he places against the mechanical repetition of the factory or mill settings. His work has a purpose, and it never degrades its subject. It is rather the system that he is criticizing. He's fighting for human, mainly children's rights to childhood. His seeming objectivity, scientific and indexical, yet posed for greater pathos, was intended to rouse the viewer to action, the creation of child labor laws. Looking at these works, one is reminded of an ironic poem of the time that goes, "The golf course lies so near the mill that nearly every day the working children can look out and see the men at play," which I think is very much the subject here. Hine lent his photographs to projects actively working towards specific improvements in slum housing, both inside and out, revealing the plight with either a single figure or a whole family working, like making paper flowers in a crowded tenement room at the right. And the climax of the documentary practice in the United States came during the Great Depression of the 30s. Certainly Dorothea Lange, who did the photographs on top, as well as other federal project photographers, planned, chose, and changed their images. As you can see, she focuses on the close-up here, on a more distant shot over here, to support New Deal programs for the alleviation of mainly rural misery, migrant and displaced families. They are made to look miserable, yet in most cases self-respecting. These are, of course, the most famous by Walker Evans. No drunks, no beggars, no vagrants. The emphasis is on the family and the unrooting and destruction of the family unit due to natural and economic causes. More unusual, and not part of the American Depression imagery, more drastic and dire, is this work by Walker Evans showing what he calls a starving Cuban family in 1933. Whether this is posed Whether this is something he actually came on is unclear. But the imagery of the family, like the single beggar of Jericho outside the door, is the most poignant image of the rejection and exclusion from human caring. Less known photographers like Russell Lee, or more known ones like the artist Ben Shahn, also contributed their work to the representation of misère. By the post-World War II era, the documentary came into its own, so to speak, but not necessarily as a weapon of reform, rather as a way of selling magazines and books, arousing interest and sympathy in the public media. In the United States, Look and Life magazine, with their documentary picture stories, flourished. Uplift was not always at stake. Sensationalism often was. The Bowery in New York City, with its drunken bums, became a theme à la mode. Yes, a morality story to be sure, but a picturesque slice of life for those who lived better, who knew they were better than that, even if they sympathized. But unlike the FSA documentary of the 1930s, these were not calls to action and support. Like the much earlier Cries of London, they were an odd and objectionable form of the picturesque, tourist views of the Bowery for those who could not make it to New York, sometimes with an ironic touch, like the sign on the right advertising precious metals by a member of the New York Photo League, a left-wing group, sometimes simply the anonymous abject, the misérable in all their isolated abjectness. All engage in the trope of the drunken bum seated on the doorstep or pavement before a dwelling or bar, the urban reject par excellence, like Jericho's. The Getty Images Archive has an almost inexhaustible supply of this photographic documentary topic. And I'm just showing a whole cross-section, you might say, some of which emphasize the garbage-like status of the bum who is lying on the ground just like the garbage at his side. These are two images by Martha Rosler, a contemporary critic of the documentary impulse, called From the Bowery in Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems, a photo text work from 74-75. And with the work of Martha Rosler, we confront the contemporary anti-documentary impulse at its most extreme, articulate and effective. And I hope you're noticing that this is not a straight line progression of showing misery that I'm talking about, but a dialectic one, going in back and forth, veering off, creating new modes all the time. And with the work and texts of Martha Rosler, we confront the temporary anti-documentary impulse at its most extreme, articulate, and effective. No wonder contemporary photographer and activist Martha Rosler dismisses the documentary mode in no uncertain terms. We, the middle-class public, have been submerged in documentary, along with all the other images, mainly media ads and messages. We have wallowed in it and the so-called sympathy or empathy it inspires. I quote Martha Rosler. Sure, images that are meant to make an argument about social relations can work, but the documentary, she continues, has so far been granted cultural legitimacy, has no such argument to make. Its arguments have been twisted into generalizations about the condition of man in general, which is by definition not susceptible to change through struggle. Her series keeps the visual reality of the Bowery architectural setting, but substitutes the derogatory terms used to describe them for the living inhabitants of the street. There is a poetic of drunkenness, she says, a poetry out of prison. Adjectives and nouns built into metaphoric systems applied to a particular state of being, a subculture of sorts, and the people in it. She continues, the photos represent a walk down the Bowery seen as arena and living space, a commercial district in which the derelict residents inhabit the small portal spaces between shop and street. And she continues, these are all names for bums and being drunk. She continues, the photos here are a radical metonymy with a setting implying the condition itself. I will not yield the material setting, though certainly it explains nothing. The photographs confront the shop squarely, and they supply familiar urban reports. There is nothing new attempted, she says, in a photographic style that was constructed in the 1930s, when the message itself was newly understood, differently embedded. I am quoting words and images both, end quote. Well spoken, Martha, say I, totally convincing. But are we willing to give up on visual representation without a murmur? Must we reject the questionable pleasures of visual representation if we are to rid ourselves of its ideological trappings, or is that throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Isn't Rossler, in a sense, preaching to the converted, to a small, sophisticated in-group who know the recent history of photography, who know the art market, and know theories of ideology? Which works best, Rossler or Géricault? And for what, and when, and for whom? Which intensifies the response to misery? Which, on the contrary, makes us consider the issue of the representation of misery itself? Is it possible even to represent misery in our media-saturated age? Some people think so. Still think so. Some, like Eli Levin, a not-so-young artist living in Santa Fe, continues in the traditional mode of misery representation, likening a drunken old man to the refuse he lies in. This sort of representation, perhaps, works better in black and white, in the print medium like etching, where both the grimness, the documentary quality, and the formal structure, a sort of cubist and certainly aesthetically knowledgeable still life exists in the garbage in the background, where these emerge more forcefully. As a final footnote to the representation of misery in the 19th and 20th century, I present the work of one of the only artists to grant agency to the poor and downtrodden, to construct them as active, politically charged actors in history, making demands, resorting to physical violence in images of great power and originality. And it is no accident that the protagonist of Katie Kolbitz's Peasant Revolution series is an active, rather than a passive, female figure, Black Anna, who urges the motley crowd of poverty-stricken peasants behind her, to action. Kollwitz said of this figure, Black Anna, "I identified with her. I felt myself to be in her. I stood at the margin of the painting so that I could enter more fully into the meaning of my print." On the left, we have one of the prints from her Weavers series, the Weavers' Strike of 1898. And on the right, the two images of Black Anna, sharpening the axe, and Black Anna, the call to revolution on the right. Both referred to actual historical occurrences, the Weavers series from 1842 and the Peasant Revolution from 1526. Of course, both series, like the events they commemorated, end tragically with the death of the strikers in the Weavers on the left, and the capture, eventual torture, and execution of the peasant rebels on the right. But the series as a whole constituted a powerful call to action to the contempt in Germany of Kollwitz's day. Though the young artist was nominated for a gold medal in the annual exhibition of 1898 by none other than Adolf Menzel, the emperor refused to grant it to her. Her art indeed produced results. And with these tragic endings, I will end my lecture. Without solutions or fixed conclusions about the representation of misery in the visual arts, but I hope with plenty of food for thought. Thank you.